Let's talk about people then. People in teams. It's one of my real obsessions is the topic of team culture, and it's something that you write about in part 2 of your book. Team culture. What are we generally missing about what it takes to be and to build a great team? What are some of the sort of first myths that come to mind about the greatest teams that your work has debunked?
Well, this is one of the big topics in my world of organizational psychology, and there are, I think, a bunch of findings that might surprise people. The first one is that we elevate the wrong people to leadership roles consistently. There's research on what's called the Babel effect, which is the idea that the more you talk in a meeting, the more likely you are to get selected as the leader of a team. So we reward people who dominate the conversation, even though they are not actually better at leadership. And often they're worse because they fail to include and learn from the voices around them in the room. They're so obsessed with being the smartest person in the room that they fail to make the room smarter. And I think what happens there is that we're consistently mistaking their confidence for competence. So we need to change that. The people I want to elevate into leadership roles are basically people who bring generosity and humility to the table. Generosity is about saying, I'm going to put my mission above my ego, and I'm going to try to make everybody in the room better. And I guess it's a form of servant leadership. And humility is about saying, it's my job to know what I don't know and try to learn from every single person I work with. And I think the idea of being a lifelong learner is something we throw around a lot, but we don't take seriously. I think part of being a lifelong learner is recognizing that every person you meet is a potential teacher. Every single collaborator of yours has lived experiences you haven't, has expertise that you don't. And if you fail to realize that, you are stunting your own progress. So I think we've got to get humble givers into leadership roles because they're there to make the team successful.
I've always had a suspicion that based on the size of the company and where it is in its life cycle, that a slightly different culture is required. And in your work, you talk about these commitment cultures. Now, a commitment culture, is that a cult?
I hope not. The good ones aren't.
Okay.
So you're anticipating the Barron and Hannon research on hundreds of startups for 15 years. And they compare cultural blueprints where some founders say, I'm going to build a star culture. I want to hire the biggest geniuses and the best talent, and that's what's going to make us great. And other founders say, no, I want to be about commitment. I'm going to focus first and foremost about, do you fit the culture? Do you live our mission and breathe our values? And then you run the horse race and ask which approach is more successful from a culture perspective. And lo and behold, the commitment cultures win. They are dramatically less likely to fail, significantly more likely to go public. And you think, we're good. Like we've hired people who are all in on our company. They made us a wildly successful startup. And then guess what? After these companies go public, they grow at slower rates.
Why?
There's a major risk that if you are hiring on culture fit, you are then saying, I'm only going to bring in people who are similar to each other. And you end up weeding out diversity of thought and background and promoting groupthink.
Interesting. So, okay, you're all a little bit too close to the same painting.
You're replicating what's already working for you and becoming more and more homogeneous. And this is not to say the culture fit is inherently bad. You do want people aligned on your 3 to 5 core values, and that's important. The mistake we make is when we look at fit, we think about, well, I want a bunch of people with the same personality traits, and I want a bunch of people who went to the same college or studied the same subject, and then you end up with a really narrow band of expertise, and that leads you to stagnate.
How important do you think the culture you're in is on your own chance of success and performance? I often think this. I think we've been lucky, even as a podcast team, to be in a great culture. And I play out the scenario, if you took one of our team members and maybe move them to another culture, how much would that impact that team member's personal performance and chance of success?
Oh, actually, there's Boris Groysberg studies this. He studies what happens when you're a star in one culture and then you move to a new organization. So he studied this with Wall Street security analysts. So finance professionals. Turns out if you are a star performer at your current firm and you leave for a new firm, it takes you on average 5 years to recover your star performance, unless you take your team with you. And then you maintain your star status from day one. What Boris argues is that we underestimate the importance of the people we rely on to do our best work. And this is not unique at all to Wall Street. You can see it in research on cardiac surgeons, where you know how it's pretty common for surgeons to operate at multiple hospitals. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that the more practice you have at hospital A, the lower your patient mortality rate is at hospital A. But then when you go over to hospital B later that week, it's as if you haven't practiced at all because you're with a different team. They don't know your strengths and weaknesses. You haven't built effective routines together. You are much more interdependent than you realize, even if you think you're an individual expert. You can see it in sports too. It takes pro basketball teams 3 to 4 years on average, even if you've recruited a really talented team, to maximize their odds of winning a championship because they just haven't figured out how to be effective together. There's even there was a NASA simulation years ago where you had to go through a flight simulator, and some crews were exhausted. They just come off of a multi-leg, multi-day sleep-deprived journey, and others were well rested. And it turned out that the well-rested crews, who were strangers, actually made more potentially catastrophic errors than exhausted crews that had just flown together. And having a little bit of shared experience was enough to compensate for the lack of sleep. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have pilots fly together and only sleep for 2 hours a night. But the idea that your history together was even more important than how alert you were is something that I think we ought to take really seriously.
Gosh, it's like a double-edged sword though, because so your history together matters. So you want to be with a familiar group of people. However, if you're too familiar with them, you're not going to come up with original ideas and be as creative and innovative as possible. So that it's a balancing act between familiarity and novelty by way of introducing new members to the group that have new ideas as it relates to business.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And you actually see this in the sports data. After that, 3 or 4 years of experience together, the benefits of shared experience start to level off. And maybe the players get old. It's part of it, but their routines also become really predictable.
Predictable to the opposition as well in the context of sports. Other coaches can go, they always do this, they always do it like this. This is how we'll defend against it.
Same thing is true in business. I think it's one of the reasons why so much innovation and disruption comes from the outside, because inside an organization, people get so attached to the way we've always done it. They fall victim to what's called cognitive entrenchment, where they start to take for granted assumptions that need to be questioned. And you need to bring in outside talent, fresh perspectives, or rotate yourself. Shift your country, shift your role, shift the group of people you're working with, go learn a new skill set in order to get out of that entrenchment.
When you think about and when you study companies and people that innovate, let's just focus specifically, stay on the idea of teams that innovate. Let's just, bring it right back to the context of even, this podcast. This podcast team is actually about 32, 33 people now across the whole sort of business of the Diary of a CEO. It's going well. We do well.
Say better than well.
Yeah. It's going well. It's like, we've done a good job. I think that's fair to say. But there's a risk with that, which is when you've been right several times, you can start to get a little bit creatively complacent. And also, I think it was Morgan Housel's book, Same as Ever, some research that shows when you are succeeding, when you're like number one at the thing you do, teams kind of switch off creatively and they go into a defense mode, which is, okay, this is how we've always done it and it got us to here, so let's just keep doing it that way. But to self-disrupt almost doesn't make sense, And so my question to you is, from what you understand, what is the best way to keep a team like ours continually striving for the next thing, even when the outside world thinks you do a lot of things right?
Best example I've ever seen was in a podcast episode I did at Pixar a few years ago. So let's go back to 2000. Pixar is at the top of its game. They've completely reinvented the way that animated movies are made. We used to think you had to draw them. Now they do them by computer. Toy Story is a huge hit. They've got monsters. They've got talking bugs. And, they're riding as high as you can in the entertainment industry. And what most companies would do in that situation is they would rest on their laurels and keep making films the way they've done them. Because like you said, like we should double down on our success. We know our core competencies. We're getting a ton of rewards for it. Well, Steve Jobs and Ed Catmull, who were running the show, were not content to rest on their laurels. And they knew that when you're succeeding, you actually have the most slack capacity to disrupt yourself. Which is, of course, when most leaders are least likely to do it because they don't think they need to. And they said, we've got to shake things up. So they went and hired an unproven director named Brad Bird. He was coming off a commercial flop. His previous film had been just a huge disappointment in terms of box office returns. And Brad came into Pixar, and his charge was to change the way that they made animated films.
Why?
Because they wanted to keep getting better and they wanted to keep innovating. Mm-hmm. And Brad came in with a vision that he was told was crazy for a new animated film. He was told it was going to cost $500 million and take 10 years to make, which is just a non-starter if you're a film studio. And Brad got frustrated and he said, all right, you know what? He said, I want the pirates. I want the black sheep. I want people who are dissatisfied, disagreeable, and disgruntled. And I'm going to build a band of misfits to try to prove that this movie can be made. And that group ends up finishing in a 3-year period. So they shaved a year at least off the original expected time. They end up coming in under budget, becomes Pixar's most successful film ever, wins them some major awards. You might have seen it. It's called The Incredibles. And what I think is incredible, no pun intended, about that story is a couple of things. One, just the will to break something that's not broken deliberately. I think that's huge. Number two, what Brad does is he discovers that there's a particular kind of disagreeableness that's really valuable. It's not just being cranky and ornery for the sake of it. It's not being a complainer. Brad says, I want people who are like racing cars stuck in a garage. Like they're just being stifled and, shot down, and I'm going to open the garage and let them go. So in my giver-taker framework, I would call those people disagreeable givers. They're gruff and tough on the surface, but they're doing it because they want to help and they have ideas to make things better. And they're not content to just stick with the status quo. And there's a bunch of research to suggest that people who are highly disagreeable, if they're challenging people because they care, they actually end up driving more innovation. And so I've actually started advising leaders that most of us know the value of a support network and surrounding ourselves with mentors and colleagues who have our back. But what you actually need to get better is a challenge network, a group of thoughtful critics who you trust to hold up a mirror so you can see your own blind spots more clearly. And Steve, this is not the norm when I work with leaders and founders. I think it's pretty common, actually. I don't want to name a specific example here, but I have interacted with a fair number of entrepreneurs and CEOs who I have this vision of them coming into the office one morning and saying, good morning. And a bunch of people go, great point. It's a scary way to live. But you know this, as you gain status and power, it's harder to get people to tell you the truth. And that's why those disagreeable givers who are willing to challenge you are so valuable.
How do you cultivate that? What can you do to cultivate a circle of disagreeable givers? Or just people that are going to tell you the truth?
Well, the first thing you do is you pay attention to who has actually been willing to push you. Mm-hmm. And you let them know that they play that role in your life. So I've actually done this in the past couple of years. I've had people who, tore apart book drafts for me, people who told me I needed to go back to the drawing board on an early version of a TED Talk. And I've gone to them and I've said, hey, you may not know this, but I actually consider you a founding member of my challenge network. First response, what the hell is a challenge network? Because disagreeable people always talk like that. Yeah. No, they don't. But I had to explain it. And I said, I know I haven't always taken your challenges well. Sometimes I've been defensive. Other times I've just been dismissive because I'm on a path and what you brought was diverting. And I regret that because I know I need you. You have to push me to think again and question the way I do things. So if you ever hesitate because you're afraid of hurting my feelings or damaging our relationship, don't. The only way you can hurt me is by not telling me the truth. And the particular conversation I found really powerful there is to let people know that they often feel a tension between honesty and loyalty. I don't see a trade-off there. For me, honesty is the highest expression of loyalty. The more candid and direct you are with me, the more I will value your input. And sometimes that's enough. In other cases, I have to go a step further, which is something that I explored in some research. Turns out that sometimes asking people for input doesn't get them over the hurdle. They're still afraid, or they think it's just an exercise in futility. So what you have to do is criticize yourself out loud and say, here are the things I think I'm bad at. Here are the current shortcomings I see in my work. And what you're doing then is you're not just claiming you're open to feedback, you are proving you can take it.
So in that instance where you criticize yourself out loud and you say, God, I'm so bad at this or that, is in part why you're doing that to make it a safe space for them to then build on what you've just said?
Yeah, you're trying to create psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson describes it. And in some research that I did with Konstantinos Koutiferis, we found that when leaders sat down and didn't just say, I want to know what I can do better at, but said, here are the things that I think I need to work on. A year later, when they were randomly assigned to do that, their teams actually were more willing to speak up and challenge them and give them constructive criticism. And I think part of what happens when you do that, and I actually do this in my own classroom, I read students some of the toughest feedback I've gotten in my career. One said that I reminded them of a Muppet. Never told me which Muppet. Thanks for that. There was another where a military leader had written, I gained nothing from this session, but I trust the instructor got useful insight. It was not fun at the time. But what I find is when I read those comments out loud afterward, I hear much more honest input from my students. They tell me things that they think are not going well in my class. They give me new ideas for improvement. And I think what I've done there is I'm showing that I take my work really seriously. I don't take myself that seriously. And, I'm sort of unoffendable is the goal. And sometimes they build, like they'll say, yeah, like we see that weakness and you still need to work on it. And other times they say, well, maybe you have a blind spot. You didn't tell us about this area where you're struggling, but we see this here. Steve, I have to say, a lot of people get the concept but are afraid to do it because they don't want to admit what they're bad at to the people who work with them. Well, guess what? The people you work with every day, they already know what you're bad at. You can't hide it from them, right? So you might as well get credit for having the self-awareness to see it and the humility and integrity to admit it out loud.
On this point of teams as well, and groups of people, the other thing that was quite challenging that I loved that you discuss is this idea that brainstorming doesn't really work well. And to maximize collective intelligence, we get more and better ideas when we work alone. And again, there's a through line here with what we said at the start about procrastination and the use of boredom. One thing that's really helped me recently that I wanted to share and see if there's any resonance with you is when I have ideas, usually when I'm alone, to be fair, or when I'm reading or when I'm thinking or writing about something, I then write them out into memos now, which is just like a couple of pages for me to understand them. And then I share them with people. Before, I didn't do that. Before, I was a bit more of a pepperer, i.e. I'd take something I was thinking about and just pepper it into like a group chat. Whereas now having time and space to write about it seems to be helping me to refine the ideas better, but just helps me to come up with better ideas. My question here is about how groups of people form their best ideas and what you would suggest based on the research.
Well, you're living the evidence. So let's unpack this a little bit. I think decades of research on brainstorming have shown that if you get a group of people together to generate ideas, if instead you would put them in separate rooms and let them work alone, you would have gotten more ideas and also better ideas. A lot of people are surprised by this, and there are a few reasons behind it that have good support. One is called production blocking. We can't all talk at once. Some ideas get lost. Two is ego threat. I don't want to look like an idiot, so I bite my tongue on my most unconventional ideas. And then three is conformity pressure, which is sometimes called the HIPPO effect. My favorite acronym, HIPPO, stands for the highest paid person's opinion.
Interesting.
As soon as that's known, people jump on the bandwagon, and you get too much convergent thinking, not enough divergent thinking.
How do we get past that in organizations? Is it about anonymity with ideas?
It can be. If you're in a low psychological safety environment where people are worried about their reputations, then yes, anonymous ideas help. But I want to get to a point where people are willing to put their names on their ideas. So I want to go in the direction that you've gone personally, which is psychologists recommend brain writing as an alternative to brainstorming. What you do is you recognize that writing is not just a tool for communicating, it's a tool for thinking. When you write out your thoughts, you can't get away with a half-baked idea that kind of is sold by your charisma. You actually get tested on your logic. And what you do is recognize that individuals are more creative than groups. They have more brilliant ideas. They have more variety than groups do. But they also have more terrible ideas than groups. And so we need a process to generate variety and then filter toward quality. And what brainwriting does is you have everybody write down their own separate ideas. Then you collect them and you have everyone do independent ratings. So you get their judgment preserved before they're biased by what their peers think. Then once you have all the ratings, you take the most promising ideas and you begin developing and refining those. And what you're trying to do then is to take the wisdom of crowds to make the ideas with high potential succeed. And I think for me, brainwriting is one of the best ways to unlock the hidden potential in the group because it is not the loudest talker. It's not the most enthusiastic speaker who necessarily has the most compelling ideas.
I was thinking as you're talking about